I'd be worried if I was on the UN if the United States is going to stay in that organization. This is the most full-throated attack on the United Nations by an American ambassador I've ever heard.
Welcome to Real Clear Politics for Wednesday, March 5th. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm joined by RCP President and co-founder Tom Bevan and Washington Bureau Chief Carl Cannon. President Trump spoke for about 100 minutes last night to a pretty contentious crowd. Here's a few excerpts I put together. I want to get your reaction to it.
The tariffs will go on agricultural product coming into America, and our farmers starting on April 2nd. It may be a little bit of an adjustment period. We had that before when I made the deal with China, $50 billion of purchases, and I said, just bear with me, and they did. They did. Probably have to bear with me again. I have created the brand new Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. Perhaps you've heard of it. Perhaps. And we've ended weaponized government where, as an example, a sitting president is allowed to viciously prosecute his political opponent, like me. How did that work out? Not too good. Not too good.
So, Tom, those are just a couple of the highlights. What did you make of the speech?
Well, Carl forced me to watch it. So I watched, actually, I would say 80 minutes of it.
Uh-huh.
I think I dozed off for the last 20 or so. My thoughts were, look, Trump was Trump. He was aggressive and, sort of laying out what he had done. And that was to be expected. Honestly, I thought the Democrats really sort of just totally mishandled the moment again. They came across really as sort of impetuous, petty, childish. I mean, Al Green sort of shaking his cane at Trump and interrupting the proceedings. Again, you make him look like a victim. And then with the little, auction signs or whatever the hell those things were, those little fans with the stuff written on it, just seemed so childish. I mean, all they have to do, right, is just sit there for an hour and a half, in this case, a little over an hour and a half, and smile and clap when appropriate. Don't clap at other times. And, that's it. And just show a little grace and get out the door. Instead, they made it all about them and they made themselves look bad. I don't know why they keep doing this with Trump, but it seems like they are unable or unwilling to stop themselves. And so they come off looking again, it was a bad night for Democrats, I think.
Well, Carl, later in the program, we're going to talk to Susan Crabtree about the official Democratic response, which was given by Elise Slotkin of Michigan. But what do you make of Trump's speech? And to Tom's point, what did you make of the Democratic response in the room?
Well, I'm going to talk to George Condon later. After you talk to Susan, talk to George Condon, White House correspondent for National Journal, about how Trump's speech fit into other similar speeches, the State of the Unions or the joint sessions Congress. Get some historic perspective. But I was watching last night. I've watched a fair number of those speeches, and what I was realizing, Andy, is that the State of the Unions have become not memorable affairs for the president's prose. They've become memorable for all the stuff Tom just talked about, the antics of the opposition party, and the who they have in the boxes. And Trump did that thing where last night he told this kid that he was appointed to West Point, that he is the commander-in-chief appointed him. That's good theater. It's all theater now, and the speech almost gets overshadowed. Although this speech, remember I put the over/under yesterday at 105 minutes. So if you bet the over, if you bet the under, you won, but barely. They've turned into this very much more partisan, and they were partisan before, but now the partisanship, there's no hiding it. And we're contentious. But that Donald Trump has a speaking style. Now, he's been on the scene 9 years now, so we know what it is. He makes fun of people. He says things in a way no other president would ever say them. Joe Biden was the worst president in history. Well, that's not how presidents spoke before during the State of the Union. They would imply that. They would run down the record of their opponent. But this guy is sui generis. He just says what, he talks like he's, a call into a political radio show in the hinterlands. But he still had his moments. And this Doge thing, they're on the defense a little bit on that. It's the one thing that the polls show that Americans, a plurality of Americans, are a little worried and think they may be going too fast, too far. There's some reason there to be on your guard, but Trump was not on his guard. He was aggressive, and he to the point where he told Elon Musk apparently to wear a suit, and Elon Musk wore a suit, and he was in the gallery, and he waved to Trump when on cue and saluted him a couple of times, and then President Trump went through this litany of, questionable expenditures from AID, and and if you watch that and you didn't know better, you'd think, well, that's where all our money's going. And I thought he was very effective in that point of view. He did a good job with families of the victims. One family, a victim of crime committed by an illegal immigrant. Another, with a police officer, a kid who wants to be a police officer, had brain surgery. That was started by Ronald Reagan, bringing these people to the president's box or the first lady's box and using them as props. And Trump's got it down. Now, I'd say one comment quickly I agree with Tom about the Democrats. I'm not unsympathetic. It is hard for them. If they, but they didn't do they think Trump's terrible. And if they applaud anything he says, they'll be attacked by their progressive base back home, but they didn't do the little things. You don't wear these costumes that the women members wear. That's too passe now. That's old. That's not a good look anymore. When the cabinet filed in, Ed Markey, the senator, Democratic senator, these other, Adam Schiff, they wouldn't even look at Trump's cabinet. Well, this cabinet includes Marco Rubio, who was a senator till a couple of months ago, and you think they could at least say hello to him. There are things that they could applaud that anybody should applaud for. They didn't. They sat on their hands. They were so sullen. Trump's trying to marginalize them as a party, and they should not marginalize themselves, is the way I would put it.
Yeah, there's a good piece on the front page of RCP today by Sasha Stone. She writes in Substack, and she said that Trump knew they wouldn't stand up and clap for anything, so he made them an offer they couldn't refuse. So they didn't stand up for a kid with multiple brain surgeries being given an honorary appointment to the Secret Service. I think that if you don't applaud that, you've got your political antenna are not quite adjusted.
They fall for it every time. And like Elon Musk says, this is not rocket science. I mean, this is like politics 101. You sit there and you smile and you don't roll your eyes. And so you're captured by the camera looking, impudent or whatever. And you clap for kids with brain cancer, and you clap for or you observe a moment of silence for a family that has lost a loved one to a heinous act committed by an illegal immigrant. And that again, it's amazing to me that they can't even figure that out.
Yeah. Well, Carl, there was polling about the speech from CBS. It was pretty interesting. It showed 76% of those who watched the speech approved of it. Although when you dig a little deeper, the audience who tuned in was mostly Republican. 51% of the viewing audience was GOP, 27% independents, only 20% of Democrats even bothered to watch.
Yeah, I was struck by that too, Andy. If the real bad news for the Democrats, and I don't think this is the case, is that their brand is sunk so low that their party ID is sinking faster than we realize. But what I think mostly it is that millions of Democrats just couldn't bring themselves to watch. There were a couple of dozen or more Democratic members of Congress that couldn't bear to watch it, and they announced that they had this little boycott. And then there were some walkouts. I don't know if that was orchestrated. I suspect it was. Members said, I can't listen to this guy. He's so terrible. He's driving me crazy, and walked out in the middle of the speech, which also wasn't a good look. But it's somewhat self-selecting audience. True.
Mm-hmm.
but that's also a thing. Our politics has gotten so Manichaean. I have friends of mine, Democrats, who I can't stand the sound of the guy's voice.
Mhm.
They really loathe Donald Trump. And I don't say that they should or shouldn't loathe him, but it's the first major speech he's given as president, and it seems to me you'd want to know what he said.
Yeah. Well, Tom, that clip that I played at the beginning, I started with that clip about the farmers because I thought that was interesting. He was signaling to the farmers that the tariffs might cause some pain. Now, he says short-term pain, but I thought it was interesting that he was reached out in that way, sort of to try to shore up what's got to be an important part of his constituency. And that either was inserted by somebody or was inserted by him because he understood that that's a reality out there.
Totally agree. I think he recognizes, and he talked about inflation and prices a little bit, and that they were going to work to try and get those down. As I said yesterday on the show, I think he still got a little bit of leeway on that with most voters, but that is coming to an end in the very near future, where he will sort of own the economy in a sort of full and fundamental way. And the implication or the imposition of tariffs, I think, he's going to own that as well. And that's what he was speaking to last night.
The other part was that, today, the day after the speech, he announced sort of, well, not quite announcement, but hinted that the tariffs on automakers is going to be delayed a month. He's obviously, he's playing it like these aren't, firm policies. That
Right.
and that they're negotiating ploys. Well, and that actually plays to his strength, because then people can say, okay, he's not being irresponsible economically. He's not adding to inflation. He's trying to get Canada, Mexico, and China to do something. It's never clear quite what, but this murkiness about when the tariffs actually go into effect seems to be part of the ball game.
Yeah. All right. Well, guys, we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom and Carl, and we'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom Bevan and Carl Cannon. And gentlemen, Elise Stefanik, who is President Trump's nominee to serve as ambassador to the United Nations, took the UN to task yesterday during a speech at an Anti-Defamation League summit in New York City. She was both cheered and booed during her remarks. And here's just a little bit of what she said.
We know the United Nations is indeed a deep den of anti-Semitism, infected with the same rampant anti-Israel and anti-American hate and moral rot that has polluted America's higher education system. Especially since the barbaric Hamas attacks of October 7th, the UN has continuously betrayed Israel, betraying America in the process, acting instead as an apologist for Iran and Iran's terrorist proxies. And I believe it's quite obvious to the world that if President Trump had remained in office, October 7th would never have happened.
So, Carl, there you get a sense of what was going on in the room. Some of it was applauded, some of it was booed, but she is not yet been voted on, in part because the Republicans want to keep her in the House because they need her vote with the slim majority they've got. But what do you make of the remarks she made the other day?
Well, there's two things. One is a Democratic member of Congress from Houston died today, so the Democrats lost a vote. And you can get cynical in this thing. My first thought was, for his family, and he was just elected, and how sad that was. And my second thought was maybe they don't need Elise Stefanik now for the vote to confirm.
Wow.
Listen, look, and mostly it was cheers. You know how this is in a stadium. There'd be 10 boos and 1,000 cheers, but you hear the boos. This is the policy of the Trump administration, and I see no reason. I mean, this is his choice. So it apparently is the policy of the Trump administration. I'd be worried if I was on the UN if the United States is going to stay in that organization. This is the most full-throated attack on the United Nations by an American ambassador I've ever heard. And this is, the thing about October 7th would never have happened if Trump was president. I don't even know where that comes from. That, of course, Trump has said this 100 times about Ukraine. He said it once or twice about Hamas. There's no evidence Hamas even knows who the United States president is or cares. But that, so that's sort of the obligatory. I don't even know what that means. But I do know what this means. If she's saying that the UN is a rot of anti-Americanism, anti-Israel sentiment, why should we host it the question arises, then why should it be in New York? Why should the United States pay, what it pays, more share than anybody else?
We pay 22%.
Yeah.
Budget, which is the most of any country. Second only China is number 2. But
and if I was in the UN, in the leadership of the UN, I'd hear that. I'd say, this is worrisome. We either better get our house in order or prepare for something else. There's nothing in the Bible or the Constitution that says the United States even has to remain in the United Nations. And President Trump has pulled the United States out of other international agreements and other international organizations and he's bragged about it without so much as a backward glance.
Yeah. Well, Tom, I remember Chuck Lichtenstein, who Carl may remember him. He was Jeane Kirkpatrick's number 2 at the UN. And at one point he said they were talking about boycotting the UN or something. And he said, "We will put no impediment in your way. The members of the U.S. mission to the United Nations will be down at the dockside waving you a fond farewell as you sail into the sunset." It's one of the great Chuck Lichtenstein lines of all time. But Carl's got a point there. If you're at the UN, are you worried that maybe the United States will just, pull its support entirely? I mean, why continue the farce if it is a farce?
Well, let's hope they're worried. Maybe they should be worried. Look, to Carl's point, this was the most sort of bracing, unambiguous language that we've heard used by a U.S. diplomat in a long time. And in some ways, it was very refreshing. I mean, I think the UN, needs to be called out for its, anti-Americanism, anti-Israel sort of hate. And that's been a topic of discussion for a long time. So in that sense, it does offer some much needed moral clarity, particularly when, we've seen what's gone on in the United States post October 7th on college campuses all around the country. And she referenced that as well. There was another speech that was given, which I watched, by Gal Gadot, the actress, and, which was also really interesting. And she said, listen, I never wanted to talk politics. I never even saw myself as, she said, I'm proud of my Israeli heritage, but I always saw myself as a citizen of the world. And I never, thought of myself in strict terms of being Israeli until October 7th. And she said, I can, like many people, it was a wake up call, and I can no longer be silent. And, we have to put a stop to this. So there's definitely, this ADO conference is definitely, they're on the attack, if you will, pushing back against a lot of the anti-Israel, anti-Jewish sentiment, anti-Semitic stuff that we've seen since October 7th.
Yeah. Well, let's stick with foreign policy for a minute. There's a little news, and the president referred to it, about the Panama Canal and Greenland, both. But BlackRock, which is this huge U.S. Financial institution, is spending $23 billion. They're going to buy the controlling interest in this Chinese company that controls 2 of the ports. And the president talked about that, but he also talked about Greenland. So let me play you what he said about Greenland, and then Carl, I wanted to get your response to both.
And I also have a message tonight for the incredible people of Greenland. We strongly support your right to determine your own future. And if you choose, we welcome you into the United States of America. And I think we're going to get it. One way or the other, we're going to get it.
So he sounded like the Godfather there to me. What do you think?
He sounded a little bit like Alec Baldwin to me, but imitating Trump. He was playing that for laughs, but you get the idea. He's kidding on the square. And if they have, ever have a plebiscite, they have 55,000 people, and Donald Trump makes some inducements that of the kind he would be able to make privately or publicly. You never know how it would turn out. He just said flatly, we're going to reclaim the Panama Canal. Now this was a treaty, but we have a treaty with Canada that says we won't raise tariffs, and Trump is the one who negotiated it. So I don't think he's going to, if he doesn't feel bound by his own treaty that replaced NAFTA, I don't think he's going to care about the treaty that Jimmy Carter negotiated with Panama. The Panama president got angry and said, yeah, Trump's lying. But he just said flatly he's going to reclaim it. And now he wants Greenland. And, I was sitting there thinking, we're going to need more ships. And then he starts talking about building ships. We're going to be the British Navy circa 1760. He starts, we're going to bring shipbuilding back, and I got all this money for that, and I got a plan for it. We need to build ships. So he's a funny kind of isolationist, isn't he, guys?
Tom, what do you make of the Greenland news and the news out of Panama? And just in terms of Greenland, they do have a parliamentary election coming up. So there is a possibility there'll be some movement on that front.
I mean, Trump is just so funny with this stuff. He refuses to sort of let it go and let it die. He always has to stir the pot. And to Carl's point, there is a seed of truth to these jokes that he's, saying. And when he says, we're going to get one way or the other, all of the folks on the left are like, authoritarian dog whistle, we're
going to invade Greenland.
We're going to invade. Yeah, no, it's a call to arms, basically. So, I mean, again, I don't see how that's going to ever happen, but Trump keeps talking about it, which is very Trumpian of him. And so we'll see, how long that goes on. I think he'll play that for laughs as long as he can.
Yeah. All right. Well, guys, we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Carl Cannon and Tom Bevan. We'll be right back after this.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of Real Clear Politics. Talking now with George Condon. George was on last week. We talked about the State of the Union. George is the White House correspondent for National Journal, a job I once held. George has now held it longer than I did. So speaking of which, George,
it takes longer to catch up with the things you did.
but it's 2 decades between us. We had that beat for NJ. Speaking of which, I was thinking you and I covered Ronald Reagan's State of the Unions when we were young reporters, newly in Washington. So we've got about 80 years between us of covering State of the Union addresses. Let me ask you about this one. Is this the longest one in history? 100 minutes?
It absolutely is.
Okay.
I think that Trump has chafed at the fact that while he had 2 of the 4 longest in history, he couldn't in the first term get past Bill Clinton. and last night he did. So 1 hour and 39 minutes, almost 10,000 words. And let me just contrast this with, I think we all agree the greatest speech in American history was the Gettysburg Address. That was 272 words.
Yeah, but you know what, though? If you think about it, Trump may have anticipated us saying this, George, because he elevated himself above Lincoln as a president yesterday. He said he was the best president, and he made an exception for George Washington, but he apparently believes he is a more successful chief executive than Franklin Roosevelt or Abraham Lincoln, which I don't know that I've ever heard a president even hint at that before.
Well, he did in the first term.
Oh, okay.
And he at another point he said that his standing in the polls is higher than Lincoln ever got in the polls. So setting aside that there were no polls in the 1860s, but
All right. So, all right, I'm going to ask you some questions, some more historical questions, because you, like me, you care about this. I'll just point out to our listeners, and if you're watching on our YouTube channel, when you cover the White House, if you're doing it right, this is my opinion. You're not just covering that president. You're covering the presidency. You're covering all the presidents who came before. And so, if George and I sound like history nerds, there's a reason for that. We don't think you can really cover that place unless you understand, what presidents are alluding to, what precedents they set or didn't set, how, whether they followed and all the power that accrues to it. And what's interesting about it is when a president comes in under the Presidential Records Act, they have to, every piece of paper in that building has to come out. It goes to the National Archives, with the exception of the reporters' files in the White House space. We stay there. And to me, that's symbolic. We're supposed to have an institutional memory of the place.
Right. And that's I've learned a little humility since Trump was elected, because we cover these very young staffers, and every new administration, they say, this is the first president to ever do this. And you sort of gently say, well, no, Ronald Reagan did that. Herbert Hoover did that, and so on. But when Trump was elected, there actually were things that no other president had done. It wasn't necessarily good things, but he was doing some things that weren't. So I no longer lecture people on, don't use the word unprecedented.
Well, let me ask you, George, about one of those precedents, because I don't know the answer. So this is not a loaded question. I'm going to rely on your knowledge here. Is it usual for a president to attack his predecessor as directly as Donald Trump did last night? I mean, he said Biden's the worst president in history. He sort of continued the campaign. But before, to me, my memory is that these things were more subtle. They hinted that they were great and that everything that came before them was terrible, especially their immediate predecessor of the opposite party. But is this new to just directly?
It is stunningly new. And
Okay.
For comparison's sake, he mentioned Biden's name 12 times in the speech. He criticized the former administration 8 times, called it insane, incompetent multiple times, and for good measure made one reference to Kamala Harris. So I went back, just half an hour ago, I went back and reread Ronald Reagan's 1981 speech to Congress to see how many times he mentioned Jimmy Carter, because God knows he won the election in large part because people didn't like Jimmy Carter's policies at the time. They didn't like the economy, didn't like inflation, didn't like the hostage thing. So if ever another president would attack his predecessor, it would be Reagan in 81. Not a single mention. The closest he came was, he said, in the last decade, regulations have grown. So he didn't say the last administration, he said the last decade. That's the closest I could find. We've never had a president relive the campaign as long as this guy is.
Do you cover him? Why does he do it, you think? What's motivating him there, and what does he hope to get out of it?
He wants, I mean, every president I've covered, with the exception of Gerald Ford, was a narcissist. I mean, to think that you can be president of the most powerful country in the world, you have to have a pretty high opinion of yourself. Gerald Ford was the exception because he didn't want to be president. He wanted to be Speaker of the House. But Trump's narcissism is of a level that is beyond the others. He wants continual validation. He wants continual praise, and he wants us to recognize a 49.9% victory as the greatest mandate in the history of the United States.
Yeah, I don't get that. The other thing he does things that you would do in a State of the Union address, or in a set piece, even an inaugural address, that you do on the campaign trail. When he was trolling the Democrats, the one time they were roused out of their stupor to applaud was when he said he supported Ukraine for 3 years. They kind of walked into that one. I mean, I know where they are on it, but then he stops. Oh, you like that? And then he says Pocahontas likes it. His slur for Elizabeth Warren. And Elizabeth Warren doesn't need me to protect her. She can be bullying and caustic too. But let's just say that I've never heard a remark like that in a State of the Union address. To me, is it in bad taste? Is it? That's subjective. But what I think is not subjective is my observation here. And correct me if I'm wrong, George. I don't want to be too hard on the president, but that's the kind of thing on a campaign trail, a give and take. Your fans like it. But he's not just speaking to voters there. Supposedly, he's speaking to the whole country and really the whole world.
Right. The reason you don't remember it is because it never has happened. before. And frankly, it was more stunning to me that he used the inaugural address for that. He made the inaugural address a campaign speech. And that is more egregious than turning a speech to Congress, where you have dueling, pep rallies and standing ovations and so.
Yeah, I'm gonna. All right, I'm gonna ask you about the Democrats who've been a little tough on the president, but I find fault with how the Democrats behave too. But I want to get your thoughts. We talked about that earlier in the show, but let me reintroduce you. You're listening to Carl Cannon. I'm the Washington bureau chief of Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM Radio, and I'm talking now with George Condon, a dear friend of mine and a White House correspondent for National Journal, a person with a great historic perspective and a good institutional memory. Listen, I'll appreciate the Democrats are in a tough position here. They really dislike Trump and they don't like what he's doing. And if they applaud anything, they'll get the progressive base back home, will beat the crap out of them. But I still thought some of these annex yesterday were sophomoric and counterproductive. Your perspective on that, George, from a historic standpoint?
Well, I mean, two things. One, it gets worse every time. I mean, we went from a congressman from South Carolina,
Joe Wilson,
lie, to Marjorie Taylor Greene's antics at the last one for Biden, to this. And I don't have any optimism that it's going to get better. And the second thing is, you alluded to, they are in a really tough spot. If I were advising the Democrats, I'm not sure what the heck I would tell them to do. I don't think there's anything effective that you can do. You sit there, you grit your teeth. He's the president of the United States. So you're there because it's the office, not the man. But it's tough when he throws out, one made up fact after another. And one of the least consequential, but my favorite, is he keeps saying that 38,000 Americans were killed in the construction of the Panama Canal, when David McCullough, who I trust is the expert on it, said it was 350 Americans. There's a big difference between 38,000 and 350, but he keeps repeating it. And that's just one example of things. And if you're a Democrat sitting there and you hear, for example, how long did he go on about Social Security, when that's a computer issue? Those people, nobody is getting paid because Social Security thinks they're 350 years old. And
I wonder about that. Look, we got about 30 seconds left, but I want to ask you, there was something Donald Trump didn't say. It was like the Sherlock Holmes, A. Conan Doyle story, the dog that didn't bark. You're nodding, George, so you know what I'm going to say, because you thought of it. You and I both thought of this. I don't think he mentioned the stock market.
No, and what was striking about that, because look at his first term speeches, and I reread them yesterday, that was one of his favorite things, thank me for your 401ks. They've gone up 60%, 70%, 80%, more than 100%, and it's because of me. And on the day when the stock market was tanking for the second day in a row, he, I guess, just forgot to mention, because they didn't want to go too long. An hour and 39 minutes is long enough. You don't want to go another minute to mention the stock market.
Well, George, you weren't there, but on our show yesterday, I put the under. I had a feeling he was going to go on and on. I put the over under at 105 minutes. So if you bet the under, you won. But I'll bet you were getting pretty nervous there near the end. I'm going to let you go now, but I want to ask you just one. Did tell the truth? Did you watch the entire speech? Did you stay up, or did you nod off like some people I could name but won't? For 5 minutes in the middle of the speech.
I did not miss a minute of it, and I was tempted at times, but I was trying to keep count of how many times he said Joe Biden. And if I looked away for a minute, I might miss that, and my count would be inaccurate.
All right. Thank you very much. You've been listening to George Condon, White House correspondent for National Journal, an old friend. Thank you. I'm Carl Cannon with Real Clear Politics, and we'll be back after this.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm joined now by Susan Crabtree. She is the national political correspondent for RCP. And Susan, you have a piece out this morning on the front page of RCP with the headline, Slotkin, America Needs Responsible, Not Reckless Change. It's a great write-up of the Democratic response to Donald Trump's speech from last night. So here's a little bit of freshman Senator Elise Slotkin from last night giving the Democratic response.
President Trump loves to say peace through strength. That's actually a line he stole from Ronald Reagan. But let me tell you, after the spectacle that just took place in the Oval Office last week, Reagan must be rolling in his grave. We all want an end to the war in Ukraine, but Reagan understood that true strength required America to combine our military and economic might with moral clarity. And that scene in the Oval Office wasn't just a bad episode of reality TV. It summed up Trump's whole approach to the world.
So pretty interesting, a Democrat invoking Ronald Reagan in her response. What did you make of that, and what did you make of the speech?
Well, I thought it was extremely effective. She is sort of everything that the Democrats have been, just wringing their hands over. The response is sort of centrist, and it was sort of the opposite of what we saw last year playing out in the election. She has eschewed identity politics. She has taken the Democratic Party to task after the election for engaging in that and not talking about kitchen table issues, hitting with it. What keeps Americans up at night is really what's going on with their bank account and inflation. I thought it was the right response at the right time, especially after what we saw with this sort of disruptive display, the bingo or auction cards, being held in the air by the Democrats that just looked a little bit, amateurish and not as effective as Donald Trump commanding the stage. But she had a very commanding presence afterwards, I thought.
Yeah. So she's an interesting person. She's 48 years old. She's a former CIA analyst. She served in Iraq, narrowly won her seat that was being vacated by Debbie Stabenow. She said in her speech that her mom was a lifelong Democrat. Her dad was a loyal Republican. So, the question that has come up a couple times today, is this really the future of the Democratic Party? Or some people have already criticized her for just what you pointed out, that she was sort of moderate, centrist, bipartisan.
Well, if you asked David Axelrod afterwards, he was saying that, Al Green, who was the congressman that was with the cane that got escorted out, was yelling at Donald Trump. He said his performance was despicable and that the Democratic Party should go in the way of Elise Slotkin. Certainly, Michigan is a swing state, so she's representing her state. She won. She's a CIA analyst who then went to work for both the Bush administration and the Obama administration. And that's interesting to me because I used to cover Representative Mike Rogers, who was a former FBI agent and an Intelligence Committee chairman. I covered him when he was chairman, and he was a very affable, very centrist type of guy as well, a very effective chairman of the Intelligence Committee. So it's not any minor thing that she won that election by.
Right. I was going to say, so this was a big race, Mike Rogers versus Elise Stefanik. It got a lot of attention in Michigan, which of course Trump carried the state, and she won tiny victory, right? Like something like 19,000 votes or 0.03% or something. So yeah, you're right. To beat Mike Rogers is no small feat.
Right. And so she's trying to say that this is how we win elections. This is how we win the majority back. We are not, we need to win these swing districts in these swing states, and we're not going to do so by, identity politics and the AOC sort of movement and talking about, transgender issues. And that's an 80-20 issue, with most Americans supporting what the president is doing by getting rid of, saying that there's two genders and trying to play down transgender politics and men and women's sports. So, I think that Slotkin is onto something. What I think she didn't address well was how the Democrats are going to do this. She talked about that she was a Cold War baby. I'm a Cold War baby as well. I grew up in that era, but it's a different time. We have lived through the longest war in our nation's history, and a very deadly two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now we're seeing in Ukraine this deadly carnage play out that Donald Trump is trying to stop. So I think the tide has turned. We're not in a Cold War anymore, thanks to Ronald Reagan and our policies of defense buildup. But now we're looking inward, and the country wants reform within our country. And I think she didn't address that very well. And I also didn't think she talked about the tariffs, the damaging tariffs that she said Donald Trump is engaging in that could hurt inflation, but she didn't say how what's the Democrats' alternative. So I thought she was strong, representing the middle ground and a good turn of the page for Democrats. I didn't think she, provided the solutions that Donald Trump, the alternatives to what Donald Trump is pushing on the agenda.
Yeah, you're listening to Real Clear Politics. On Sirius XM, I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Susan Crabtree. The Democratic response, and I take your points on what you did right and what you did wrong. But, any response, this is sort of the booby trap of American politics. And it's always some up and coming politician. This is going to be their chance to make it. And, Senator Katie Britt, Alabama, kind of flamed out last year. Everyone remembers Marco Rubio with his bottle of water that he kept drinking. So you can get in trouble in any number of ways. It did seem to me that the staging was good, that she was calm. There were no gimmicks. So just in terms of a piece of television, I thought it was one of the most effective ones I've seen. But not everyone is such a fan. This is Tom Nichols writing in The Atlantic. He said, Slotkin's address suffered from the same half-heartedness that has seized the Democrats since last November. Her response and the behavior of the Democrats in general showed that they still fear becoming a full-throated opposition party because they believe that they will alienate voters who will somehow be offended at them for taking a stand against Trump's scheme. So just a couple minutes left here, but raises the question is, which I've sort of asked before, but, that sort of hair on fire attitude that you sort of saw in the chamber, that's what a lot of Democrats are calling for. And I'm wondering if, on reflection, people will look at this and say, it was great, it was a nice speech, but she's not where we want to be. We need to be full-throated. We need to be a real, lively opposition to what I think Nichols called it, the hallucinatory politics that we're engaged in right now.
Well, there's appealing to the base, and then there's winning elections. And certainly after the losses from last November, the party needs to reevaluate. And certainly Axelrod and others are promoting the Slotkins of the world and her more centrist, calm, steady, reasonable versus reckless, responsible kind of messaging. Now, of course, when you talk about USAID and other DOGE cuts, the Democrats are going to be hair on fire opposing that, and many of them think that's an effective message and strategy. And today we see the Supreme Court actually siding against the Donald Trump in terms of the $2 billion freeze on foreign assistance. So, those voices are going to be out there. I think all the party needs to be represented in terms of a strategy standpoint. But in terms of winning swing states and winning elections in terms of general elections for presidential, for the president and for control of Congress, I think the Democrats would be wise to listen to the Slotkin messaging. They do need to come up with alternative solutions, however, and I think that's where she was lacking.
Yeah, great. Well, Susan, always great to have you on. Appreciated her pieces on the front page of RCP today. I highly commend it to you. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.